Instagram. Just talking about, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? Do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? And preparing for your next season. And I'm calling asking the game changers, because oftentimes when you are the one that has chosen to show up in your family in a certain way, to ask the right questions and that type of thing, first to yourself, it sometimes can be requires something of you that you've never seen. You don't have a reference for it. If you're a business owner, you may not have a reference for that. Yet you have this call towards something. You want better for your life. You want to share part of your life in a different way. You want to experience your life differently. And sometimes you don't always know why that is, right? And so my question to you came from my reflection this morning when I was looking at the post. There's a picture that I have posted that says, prayer is my superpower. But the truth of the matter is, I don't always use my superpower. How about you? I want you to put in the chat, what's your superpower? Well, I'm not going to rush today. I'm going to take my time in this space. What's your superpower? Put it in the chat. I want to call it out. What your superpower is. Work with a sister today. Because every woman has a superpower. Every woman has her superpower, and it shows up sometimes in the way that we show up for other people. But when it's time for us to show up for ourselves, there's a forgetfulness. Even with all the training that I've had, there are times when I forget my superpower. And I was saying on my post about how my superpower is prayer. And many of you all may not know this, or don't care, or don't have any relevance to you. I'm ordained minister of the spoken word. My throat, my mouth are anointed, and I have instructions. Every ministry doesn't necessarily do it that way, but I'm a minister of spiritual consciousness, right? So even when I talk about pleasure and sacred sexuality and any of that, it filters in through spiritual science, universal law, metaphysics, and that type of thing. And over the years, I've been 20 years in this work, in this game. I can only imagine, hey folks, I can only imagine for those who are 1 year in, 2 years in, maybe even 5 years in, or just waking up, so to speak. And are you able to distinguish, one, when you are operating in your true happiness, your joy, your pleasure? Because a lot of times when we talk about pleasure, we still only have an external reference of pleasure. And our pleasure oftentimes is still attached to getting something, or proving something, or even your orgasm sometimes can be still attached to getting something. There's still women who compare their orgasms. I was just talking to a woman just the other day, a client, and she was telling me how she wanted to have, I'm not going to say exactly, but she didn't say the proper name of the orgasm. I knew what she meant, but when I asked her what was the orgasm that she wanted to have, she couldn't articulate the orgasm. She really didn't know the anatomy of it. She didn't know how it operated, but she had read something somewhere and then began to judge her sex life and her own ability based off of what she had read from somewhere else. And I explained to her what she was saying, right? But that happens a lot of times when we get into situations where we expand our knowledge, we expand our understanding. We keep going for more, but we haven't mastered the thing that we already have. So I'm asking you, what is your super power? I see somebody in the comments said, I want to be happy and I want to be right. Y'all got to talk back to me on Instagram too. One sister just straight up said, I want to be happy and I want to be right. Now listen, that's a truth right there, because some people do not actually tell the truth, that you want to be happy and you want to be right. You want to have it both ways. But what does being right really mean at the end of the day? Because sometimes we get to be right about our woundology as well. And so let's take, for instance, I asked you what your superpower is, right? And I see someone put in here, if you're watching on Instagram, I don't know if the numbers are accurate or either on either platform, but if you're watching either way, just drop in one thing that you know is your superpower. My second question, go ahead while you're dropping in what your superpower is. Because every woman has a superpower. And if you don't know what your superpower is, you got to get in proximity to other women, in a tribe, a process that helps you to activate you knowing what your superpower is. And don't feel any kind of way if you don't know what your superpower is. My second question to you is, do you use your superpower? Do you use it? I'll give you another example. I do happen to have a healthy tribe of women around me, and oftentimes in our conversations, when I have when I have an amnesia, a spiritual brain fart, and I can't remember the rituals that I might have just recommended to someone else, the beauty of sisterhood, it helps you to remember. Do this, try that. And sometimes it's so basic. My question is, do you use your superpower? Do you use it regularly? Because a lot of times, the scripture says, in all thy getting, get understanding. Now, of course, when we evolve in our language and our study, you're not necessarily trying to stand under anything. So we'll say, get understanding. But in all that getting, because a lot of times we are still trying to get more, but you haven't mastered the one thing, the basics. And one of the things that I heard in my birthday reflection was back to the basics. Like, really just do the basic stuff to amplify this next level, this next season. Because what happens sometimes as women, I see that some say your superpower is encouragement. I see empathy. Keep on dropping your superpowers in here. This is good. This is good. Because my question to those of you who dropped it in the comments is, if that's your superpower, do you use it for yourself? Not just for other people. Because, honey, I could pray the paint off the walls for someone else sometimes. But do I do it regularly for myself? Not all the time. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm going into this 48 days of prayer, inviting people into the 48 days of prayer, because I constantly, as a coach, am asking women, particularly those of you who are talking about being alchemical women, brujas, you're talking about doing all of this advanced level work and magic, but you don't have a daily practice. Because this is how you charge your battery, because life is going to continue to happen. There are going to be things that are going to be out of our control. But when you are not full, the one incident can drain you. And if your core beliefs are not fully clear, and I say fully with some condition, because when we talk about trauma and in the realm of psychology, trauma changes who you are, any type of trauma. And we sometimes underestimate, because over it, because sometimes it makes us uncomfortable to process through certain things. And some of us don't even have the tools. Many coaches actually don't even have the tools to know how to process through certain trauma. I can't tell you the number of women who I coach, and a lot of times when there's a deep issue like rape or molestation or incest or physical abuse, I ask the question, have you ever had therapy? And so a lot of times we are looking at people and assessing people based on our value of what we think is normal, what we think a person should be over, but we don't know that it never was treated in the first place. It never was treated. And so what happens when a woman goes on to marry or have children, or she's achieving in her life and in her world? What happens when this is going on? And so even the woman, she may be significant out in the world, but at home privately insignificant or struggling with. I heard TDJ say something too about spiritual gifts in terms of a superpower, and I love this. I love this. I wish somebody had told me this, because oftentimes the gifted person does not see themselves. Some of you who are game changers, who are gifted, who are called to be the one to shift the paradigm. Some of you are still entering into rooms like you are waiting on other people to shift when you are the one. And I don't know why this has been my message to so many people in the last few weeks. You really are the paradigm shifter. You are the one that's bringing the energy, but you're still waiting on somebody else to be the one. A lot of that is conditioning. Hey sis, how you doing? Thank you for saying hello and dropping in. A lot of people are still waiting on someone else, and then you just need a reminder. Oh, I'm that one. You are that one in your family. You are that one. And I am not talking about being overburdened and martyring yourself. I am not talking about that kind of thing. I am talking about you are on earth to be in assignment. On assignment, excuse me. You are supposed to, I got the boobage in there for you for Facebook. But you are born with an assignment. You are born. And listen, I love this story. You know, biblical stories can actually provide a lot of freedom for those of us who are not familiar with biblical stories. And I was actually ministering to masculine energy in my life, and we were talking about Samson and how Samson was born with his assignment. Samson he came here knowing who his name had a meaning. He was already anointed, all of this stuff. But how many of you didn't come here necessarily knowing? You had to learn it along the way. But Samson came here already with his assignment, but he kept laying his head in the wrong lap. Now, some would say that was a part of his journey. That was a part of his coming out process, if you will. And it cost him a lot, actually, right? But he kept laying his head in the wrong lap. And sometimes when TD Jakes was saying how many people who are gifted cannot see themselves. I cannot tell you how many years of my life other people would see my gifts. I tell this story a lot of times about how I remember when one of my master teachers came to me, the very first one, and told me about a specific anointing. I don't even want to say it right now publicly because I don't want to go into the context of that right now. I'm not hiding it or anything. I just want to stay focused. But she talked to me about this particular assignment on my life. And I was kind of flipped when she told me what it was that I was supposed to do. I said, Well, she said, well, they said, apparently she had read it. And she said, they said this and they said that. And I said, well, they didn't tell me. And honestly, I lived in resistance and reluctance after saying yes to my assignment for so many years. I know I'm talking to somebody out there who has done this before. I know that there are some people who have been reluctant leaders, reluctant to step in the fullness. And oftentimes it's because your assignment may be the same title as somebody else's, but it may not be the same definition. You came for it to look different here on earth. So somebody could say, hey, you're supposed to teach girls. And you like, I'm not a teacher, because you automatically hear teacher and think classroom. Some of you who hear that you are on assignment or anointed or called, some of you automatically, hey sis, automatically hear ministry. And it's not necessarily that. And because oftentimes we are looking at everybody else around us, and if you don't have a reference point, you go to what is most available to you. And so when she said this about my particular anointing, I was like, oh my, I like that. No, I'm not doing that. And then I will tell you, it was around ministry, because I was like, look, I'm not doing that. I'm not trying to be doing a Sundays, preach on Sundays. I don't want people putting me in a box talking about you can't do this because you're a minister. I went to all the things that it can't be, all the things that it couldn't do. Never really, because at that time, yes, I had a spiritual understanding and I had an immense landscape and library, but I still was coming out. And sometimes we need to give ourselves permission and time to fully experience ourselves without trying to go get another thing, another something attached to another thing. And so I had not had enough time in that, right? I, in my opinion, was just getting free from traditional religion, free from the confines of religion. I was just getting free. And so here comes this big assignment on my head that I'm hearing that this work I'm supposed to do. And I'm like, oh no. And so listen, this connects to, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? Because some of us have the reflex to say no before we say yes, because we haven't had a model of what living in our yes looks like. We haven't had a model of what what an interruption is without it being offensive, or we're too worried about it being offensive or hurting someone, or someone hurting us for that matter. So my question to you around your particular gift is, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? Because some of you know. Some of you actually do know. I have talked to some of you. Hint. I won't even look in the direction of a particular camera. So I'll just look up here and say, some of you have told me that you are scientists. You are you are mathematicians. Some of you have told me that you are seamstress and chemist, and some of you are artists, but your profession is not necessarily that particular thing. Some of you are in marriages and in relationships where, yeah, you are technically in relationships, but yet not fulfilled. And so my question to you is, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? Because listen, putting it off, the delay, is only you denying yourself the fullness thereof, the fullness of your own expression. At a certain point in this journey, you stop having anybody else to look at. And so my question, a lot of times this question would apply to women who have lived a little bit, right? Because when I look at my superpower, when I talk about prayer being my superpower and not always using it, it seems like an oxymoron, right? Doesn't it seem like an oxymoron that I'm talking about ministry, yet I'm saying that I don't always fully use my particular superpower? I know people, listen, how I know people who are doctors, and it's such a prestigious position or post. We have prestigious titles in something that we may be doing in the world, and that's not who you are. That's not what you are called to be, to do, or to have. And so when I look at this opportunity around this 48 days of prayer, one of the things that consistency does for us is sometimes half the battle is just learning how to show up. Half the battle is just learning how to show up, and how to show up consistently. Many of us will show up for an event, will show up for other people, will show up for anything that is our regularly scheduled program. But when it is something that you are being called to that's outside of your normal. So let me just say, there are people who, when they hear something about prayer, you will think about the traditional prayers and may be turned off. But how will you know if you do not give yourself an opportunity to experience something different? I find it so interesting that oftentimes the people who cannot pay for coaching are also the same people who do not have a daily practice. Because the truth is, we do not really believe, one, that we are the ones that are the game changers. Because we have been institutionalized by school to think that there is something else that someone else has to validate in us. Sometimes I talk to people who are gifted, but you need your gifts validated in the form of a degree. And really all you need to do is just start. I talked to someone who has a gift for interior design, but yet she wants to go to interior design school. But has anybody ever been around us that just told us just start? Start where you are. We don't really believe a lot of times the very scriptures that we've been conditioned to bind ourselves under. So when we talk about our gifts making room for us, we don't really believe that, because if you really believed it, all that is required for belief is 51%. 51%. And that applies to me too. I have a very big vision. There are certain things that I have not manifested, and it's only because I got to go back sometimes and do some cleanup, some detox, some forgiveness work. Sometimes there are things that we're holding on to when we talk about even money. Still, there are people who do not believe that money is my own natural energy yield. There's still people who do not fully believe that. And so when you don't believe something, the tendency is to check out. And sometimes we also have a very extreme way of being all in or all out. We're, all in, we don't have a balance or equilibrium around certain things, particularly if it triggers you or reminds you of something that you have experienced, but you aren't necessarily clear from. So I ask you, do you really desire to be happy, or do you desire to be right? Because there are so many conversations floating around in this internet world, this social media world at all times. I give you some examples. I'm going to throw out a few things that's out there at all times, right, for us to look at and attach ourselves to. One is this conversation around settling. There is this conversation around accomplished women who I talked about loneliness earlier. Hey, how you doing, love? I talked about settling. Many accomplished women who are significant out in the field, but privately feeling insignificant at home. There's this thing around I'm not settling. where did you develop this idea of this standard around around settling? Someone says that when a woman starts to get close to a certain age, particularly in her childbearing years, she starts to reconsider and what's coming along. I don't know. Is that true? How many of you made some decisions when because you said your biological clock was ticking? How many of you made some decisions that you're not too happy with because of that buying into the biological clock thing? Okay. Now, settling is one conversation that sometimes we engage in. But what about, come on now, talk back to me, because y'all looking at me over here in our tribe. I want y'all to talk back to me now. It's not a one-way conversation. Right? So it's so settling. I challenge this idea around settling a little bit, because it's not sometimes that we have high standards. A lot of women are still operating in fear and in outdated models in terms of the paradigm, where we're still looking for someone to take care of us, rescue us. And this is, I'm going to talk about this next week. I was going to get into it this week because some people think that the first book that I wrote was this, My Juicy Rebirth. This is not my first publishing, actually, right? One of my first publishings was a book of prayers, actually. And then this second one is this book, this compilation series, Still Daddy's Girl. And so for Father's Day, we're going to talk about this whole daddy's girl trauma sometimes when we talk about this settling and relationships, right? So we're going to do that next week. I don't want to get into it too deep today, but I was about to read this, but I hadn't even read this in so long. But boy, when we talk about settling, boy, the lessons that I learned from my little girl broken heart around daddy. So that's one thing. Then there is this whole thing about this thing about, this that we've been through with relationships. And a lot of times we have this victim mentality. So then we'll attach to this thing around soul ties. Y'all talked about soul ties before. Have y'all ever seen that post that goes around with the woman split down the middle and inside of her are these heads? And a lot of people love that post. A lot of women attach themselves to that particular post. I don't, because I believe that when a woman begins to heal her relationship with her womb and her femininity and her sexuality, that you have a lot more understanding of how much influence we do have, and those soul ties can be cords that we cut. You don't have to be tied to nothing, but a lot of times we attach ourselves to these concepts because they're popular, they sound right, we've heard them before, but we attach ourselves to them, and then they become another belief. And then so I'm just throwing out a few things: settling, soul ties. Come on, y'all, throw a few of them in the comments. Have you ever challenged some of these things that we attach to? Another one is single mothers. Single mothers. That's a big one. That's a big badge of honor that a lot of women walk around with, about raising your children by yourself. But when we really study the ancients and study more of a tribal culture, we always operated in tribe in terms of supporting one another. There was a period of time where the children at a certain age was with the woman anyway. But that's a whole horse of another color. I had to shift because a lot of times our sisters are attaching themselves to statistics created by people who don't love us. We are attaching ourselves to statistics about our men, about our body, and even the biological clock. You get to be right or you get to be happy when it comes to the biological clock. A lot of the statistics when it comes to your womb and to yourself, they don't even apply to melanated women in terms of the statistics. And it took a Caucasian doctor, female doctor, who said that black women oftentimes should never quote the statistics of the American Medical Society for, and I might be saying the official name wrong, forgive me. But you know what I'm talking about, when it comes to your womb health. But we attach ourselves to these things without challenging them. And so I just want to ask you, are you ready for a paradigm shift? If you are watching on Instagram, you can watch the remainder of this particular broadcast on YouTube or come into Rebirth Woman on Facebook. I'm going to end the broadcast on Instagram intentionally, just because of their parameters. But I love you. There's nothing you can do about it. Please join us in the 48-day prayer challenge. You don't have to join for all 48 days. It's more of a challenge even to myself, but I explained it on the other video, why 40, because we know that it takes 21 days to start a new habit, and it really takes almost 90 days to shift a whole paradigm. So 48 days is somewhere in the middle. So join me on the other end, and I'm going to wrap up here